Starting off with the new news, you are appointed ambassador to Israel. What unique experiences or perspectives would you bring to this position?
Well, my first trip to Israel was when I was 17 years old, and it was about a month before my 18th birthday, July of 1973. So for almost 52 years, I've been making trips to Israel and have been there probably over 100 times now. Started taking groups of people in 1981 and created the tour company for that purpose, and have taken tens of thousands of people to Israel over the course of this time. Gotten to know a lot of the government officials. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been a friend of mine for over 30 years. He invited me to come campaign for him back in 2018 when he was running for re-election as Prime Minister. As soon as this announcement came, he called within an hour. The former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Ron Dermer, called. Foreign Minister called. These are all people I've known. So the connections that I have in Israel are pretty intensive, but it's a passion for the country and for its unique place in the world that I find so appealing. There's a magnetism about Israel that is just incredible. And even my first trip there, I'll never forget, it was surreal to be there. And you got to know, in 1973, Israel was a struggling country and democracy. It was still trying to get its feet on the ground. It hadn't been in its modern existence that long. And it was not that overly developed. Roads were rather primitive. A lot of people lived on kibbutz because they didn't have any other way to survive. Over the course of the time, what I've seen is Israel has blossomed. It has fulfilled biblical prophecy that the desert shall bloom and the dry bones shall live. And that's exactly what I've witnessed with my own eyes. And now it's one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. They are the leading innovators in medicine, agriculture, high tech. When people say, well, what has Israel done? If you have a cell phone, you wouldn't have the technology of that without what was developed in Israel. So there's so many things that we take for granted as American citizens that resulted from technology developed in Israel.
Okay. And then further on that, how do you think your background in politics, media being our former governor, how do you think that those and the understanding of those issues on on more of like a smaller level, a smaller scale in Arkansas, how do you think those, the understanding of those will help you with dealing with the issues that Israel is facing currently?
Well, while the issues are obviously very different when you're dealing with the complexities of the Middle East, I think a lifetime of dealing with people is applicable wherever it is, whether you're dealing with a legislature or you're dealing with people in a congregational setting, or you're dealing with people in an international capacity. As governor, most people don't realize how many international opportunities one has as a governor, dealing with trade issues. So, trips to Asia and Europe and the Middle East during my tenure as governor, you do get familiar with a lot of cultures. You learn things about protocol. But throughout my adult life, before being governor and certainly after, because I've had a lot of business relationships overseas, consulting with businesses in a number of parts of the world, and then being in Israel many times a year and developing relationships with people both in the public sector and government, but also in the private sector and some of the businesses and enterprises that are there. So I won't go into it looking around saying, where am I? I kind of know my way around. I've been from Dan to Beersheba so many times that, I have a familiarity with it that very few people probably will have had going into this. Of course, the big thing hadn't happened quite yet. Senate confirmation must be cleared, and that'll be an important step. And I would like to think that I will be confirmed, but nothing is certain in this world, certainly not in politics.
Okay. With U.S.-Israel relations, what do you see as the most important issue that the U.S.-Israel relationship right now, and how would you like to work to strengthen that alliance?
One of the reasons that I was willing to accept this assignment is because Donald Trump has done more for Israel-U.S. relationships than any president ever. His moving of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was historic. The Abraham Accords, for which he should have been given a Nobel Peace Prize, was a breakthrough, a huge breakthrough in bringing relationships between Israel and many of the Muslim countries, like the UAE, and it really was dramatically important to continue that, and that's one of the things that I know he wants to be able to get done. I just think it's a unique time in history where we really could work toward achieving a more stable Middle East, dealing with the Iranian issue, which is the reason that it's not very stable, and all their proxies. But what an incredible, opportune moment to be a part of this. The difference between the Biden administration and what was and what will be the Trump administration is that the Biden administration said often the right things about we're with Israel, ironclad relationship, but then they would turn around and put more pressure on the Israelis about a ceasefire than they would about the Iranians for funding everything that created the need for a ceasefire. And I've never understood why they did not put the squeeze on the Iranians, their government. That's where the funding has come from for Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. And until that stops, we'll continue to see this level of terrorism.
Okay. So going into what you just said, how would you approach the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
There has to be a recognition that Israel has a right to exist. Heretofore, the people who lead the Palestinian Authority have said Israel shouldn't be there. So you can't have a process of peace if one side says the other one should be annihilated, that they don't even exist. And if you look at a map, walk into the old city of Jerusalem and go to a Palestinian-owned store, and you'll see that there are maps, and you look at them, and Israel doesn't even show up on the map. You're thinking, how come? Because they don't believe it should be there. Well, that's no process to peace. So there's got to be an understanding that, yes, Israel really does have I would use the term divine right. They've been there for 3,500 years, going back to the time of Abraham. And to deny the Jewish people a homeland, to deny them a safe and secure homeland, is an abomination of great proportion. You know, the little sliver of real estate that they own is 1/644th of the land that is controlled by Muslim countries. So to say, oh, they need to give up some land for peace, well, every time they've given up any land for peace, they didn't get more peace, they got more violence. So I think increasingly people understand that's not a solution. That's not a prescription to make this work. There does have to be an understanding that not only Jewish people live in Israel, but there are people who are Christian and there are people who are Muslim, and there's got to be a way for people to live there peacefully and prosperously. But Israel has made those accommodations time and again. But I don't think you can have two different governments trying to run the same piece of land if one of them doesn't think the other should even exist.
Okay. So in, the opposite side of that would be something like, well, the war has gone on for however long now, and about a year and a half?
Yeah, a year and 2 months, yeah.
And so I think what people look at is the amount of the death toll.
Yeah.
And there's just been so much in Palestine that it almost could seem like it's going overboard.
This entire horrific war could have ended immediately if Hamas had laid down their arms, stopped firing rockets into civilian territory, and given up the hostages. None of those things they've done. They have not yet been willing to do anything in good faith. The humanitarian supplies that have been sent there, billions of dollars worth, they've stolen, and they didn't give it to the people. They kept it for themselves. And Hamas is, by our own State Department definition, a terrorist organization. They're not a legitimate government, yet they govern Gaza. It's a tragedy that could have and should have been avoided. A lot of the civilian deaths in Gaza, which are awful, they're there because what Hamas has done is they put their civilians in front of their military weaponry as human shields. That's unthinkable. Can you imagine if the United States said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to take families and babies and we're going to place them right in front of the rocket launchers, so that to take out the rocket launchers, you're going to end up taking out civilians. Well, Americans wouldn't tolerate that. But that's why so many civilians have ended up dying. And yet the Israelis have gone to great lengths to try to prevent collateral damage and the unnecessary death of civilians, all of which could have been prevented had October 7th not happened, and then had Hamas been willing to recognize that what they did was so evil, so incredibly evil, that they needed to stop, let the hostages go, negotiate some kind of genuine ceasefire, none of which they've been willing to do.
And a comment, also on the other side of that, just devil's advocate, would you say that they're fighting for their land? Even as a terrorist organization, would you say that they're fighting for their land that's deemed Palestine, for the Gaza Strip?
Yeah, they have had absolute control of Gaza. There was no Israeli presence there, none. In fact, in 2005, part of what Israel did was they took 10,000 Jewish families, or 10,000 Jewish people, out of Gaza. They forcibly moved them. The Israelis moved their own Jewish people out of Gaza and said, it's all yours. They had 100% of it, total control. They could have built one of the greatest resorts in the world right on the Mediterranean. It could have been incredibly prosperous. But what did they do? They spent all the money, the billions of dollars that were given to them, and they built underground tunnels in order to wage vicious war against Israel and the Israeli citizens. It's a tragedy that should never have happened. What's worse is the people who lived in Gaza voted to give the government to Hamas. And now they're paying the price for having turned over the rule of Gaza to a terrorist organization. Again, a tragedy that could have been avoided, should have been avoided, but their land is completely in their control. But they've abused it. And instead of helping to build streets and schools and a better life, they built tunnels so their military, terrorists and organizations could hide and escape and now hold hostages. It's just a extraordinary, historic kind of tragedy that should have been avoided.
Okay, and how do you see yourself navigating the alliances here throughout the Middle East? And there's a lot of pieces in play. There's Iran. Yeah. That's basically, the hub, giving funds to everyone else to kind of protect them, and then there's a U.S.-backed Israel. Yeah. How do you see this playing out?
Well, I got to be careful because an ambassador doesn't get to have his own policy. He has the policy of the president. As I look at the policies that President Trump had in place for the first 4 years, the reason that he was successful and there was relative peace in the Middle East was because he put maximum pressure on Iran. And that's really the most important single thing that has to happen. They're the ones who have funded Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. The proxies of the Iranian government, that's where the problem starts. But you also have some complicity with the government of Qatar, who have shielded some of the Hamas leaders who live in wonderful, luxurious hotels in Doha. And they're not even in the middle of the battles that their people are going through. So it starts with dealing with the Iranians effectively, putting the pressure, putting the sanctions back in place. You don't have to bomb the Iranian government, you have to bankrupt them, which is exactly what President Trump was doing, and it was working. It was working brilliantly. Biden administration came in and immediately reversed all those policies, which what that did, it put money back in the hands of the Iranian mullahs. They suddenly had oil money. They were selling oil again. They couldn't before, now they could. And within a very short period of time, they were flush with billions of dollars. What did they do with it? Did they feed their people? Did they build a better life? Nope. They bought rockets and missiles and military equipment, and they aimed it at Israel and started killing civilians. That's a tragedy, and it should never have happened.
Okay. On the topic of Iran, are you familiar with the Shah?
The Shah?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, of course, from the...
In the rain, and then the mullahs came.
Yeah,
and they
in 1979, I remember it well, yeah.
So with that, I think there is a movement to, also from the Iranian people, to get rid of that regime.
Yes. The greatest thing that could happen is an uprising from the Iranian people to get rid of the mullahs, which has been devastating to the Iranian people. And I hope people understand there is a real difference between the Iranian government and the Iranian people. If people look back at the Persian culture, one of the most magnificent cultures of all of human history, the art, the architecture, the culture, everything that was developed there, and even just going back to the time just before the mullahs, it was such a modern, magnificent place. You look at, they were leaders in fashion, they were leaders in technology, virtually everything. It was an absolutely delightful country, economically prosperous, not perfect. You know, it wasn't, no country is, but you look back and you see the beauty of their people. I mean, my goodness, it was just really a place to behold. And Tehran was teeming with life and prosperity. The mullahs came in, the Ayatollah took over. They enforced rigid and just disgusting pressures, particularly on women, and made it where women were virtually enslaved. And if you think back, I mean, the women of Iran were some of the most, I guess, liberated people in all of the Middle East. Theirs was a culture that was the envy of so much of the world. And the impositions of totalitarianism on the people. But I say again, women, taking away their capacity for education, for leadership. And now it's been 45 years of that. I have to believe deep down there are so many people, and I know there are. There was almost an overthrow back in 2009 when the Green Movement rose up in Tehran. And I think it was this close to happening. The U.S. wasn't being asked to go in and do it for them. But I'll never forget when President Obama was in office at that time, he did not give any encouragement. He said nothing. And I honestly believe that if he'd have just made a statement of support for the people and the encouragement, they would have done it themselves. If we'd kept the sanctions in place that President Trump put there, it probably would have happened because the economic collapse of Iran would have led to an overthrow of the mullahs. At some point, that will hopefully happen. And that's what I'm optimistic, is that when President Trump comes back into office, once again apply those sanctions, put the pressure on them without having to bomb them, but bankrupt them, and then let the people rise up and get their country back and restore this extraordinary and delightful and really enviable Persian culture that was a part of the Iranian people.
There's already, I think, been some sort of movement ever since the Masa Amini with the head coverings, and I think people are kind of moving towards that. So with, just to be clear, the sanctions would put pressure, monetary pressure, on the government. And the goal is to make the people rise up and overthrow, just like they overthrew the Shah with the mullahs.
Yeah.
Okay. What are the most pressing challenges in U.S. foreign policy as of right now?
I think it's people across the globe need to see the United States as strong. We don't need to be the policeman of the world. President Trump has been very clear about that. Not to go fight everybody's battles for them, but also to make it clear that the United States will stand with its allies, whether it's Israel or Taiwan or whoever that may be, and to serve notice that countries shouldn't be acting as bullies. China is some nation that we really do need to be concerned about their tenacity toward trying to be the military power of the world. And they're not wanting to be that for defensive purposes. Nobody's talking about invading China, taking over their country or their culture. But they are talking about taking over countries and cultures across the globe, and that is a concern.
Okay. And following that, how do you plan to balance U.S. national interests with Israel's interests in this volatile state right now?
Again, an ambassador carries out the responsibilities of the policies of a president. You don't get to make them yourself, but there's already such a powerful relationship between the U.S. and Israel. We share intelligence, we share technology. A lot of things most Americans probably don't even think about that they benefit from innovations of the Israelis. Something as simple as a cherry tomato, developed in Israel, the seedless watermelon, developed in Israel, cell phones and the SIM cards, developed in Israel, a lot of the heart stents and medical procedures, developed in Israel, agricultural use of water, which is incredible in terms of what Israel has done to make agriculture possible in areas that otherwise would be just deserts. So we benefit from those technologies, but we benefit from the military intelligence and the sharing of hardware that has created the Iron Dome and David's Sling and so many of the defense postures that without, there would be hundreds of thousands of dead Israelis right now. But those technologies have saved the lives of civilians. And God forbid we ever are under attack in the United States, those technologies would save Americans.
What would success look like in these 4 years for you?
I would love to see a time when Israel and their families could go to bed at night not expecting to be awakened several times during the night and having to rush their kids within 15 seconds to a shelter and to a bunker. It would be great that prosperity would begin to happen not only for the Jewish people of Israel, but for the Arab and Muslim people of Israel. There have been many times when Israeli companies would go into a community, maybe in Judea and Samaria, and they would hire Muslim and Arab families and workers. They worked alongside Israelis. It worked beautifully. They got the best wages of their lives. They got benefits. They got health care, educational grants for their children. They really started experiencing prosperity. And then, for reasons that are very hard for me to understand, you have people in the United States and in Europe who are pushing, the BDS movement of divestiture and boycott and sanctions against Israel, which means that you take companies that were prospering and giving the best jobs of their lives to people who are Arab or Muslim, and you make them shut those factories down and those businesses down, and people go back to living in poverty. Now, how did that benefit anyone? There's capacity for there to be peace, but it doesn't happen if in the schools run by the Palestinian Authority, you're still teaching children in the first grade that the greatest honor of their lives is to kill a Jew. That you name parks and streets after people who murder a Jew, which still goes on. That can't keep going on because that is disruptive to any level of building a generation of people who can respect the Jewish residents of Israel.
I'm going to ask a question that is just coming to my mind.
Okay.
With all of the, there were protests on campuses here in the U.S. There were, there was a big movement, and a lot of people, we're kind of on the side like, please stop bombing the Palestinians. The Palestinian people haven't done anything wrong. I mean, it just kind of seems like with so much power in the world that there is a way to kind of contain this and lessen this disruption without killing so many people. Is that a possibility?
It is if the people want to get rid of Hamas. Tragically, they voted Hamas in power. They've got to reject that. They can't continue to empower a terrorist organization to run their community. So that's got to happen.
Do you think they have the power?
They had the power to put them in. They need to use the power they have to turn them in, to let people know where are the hostages. Let them be freed. But on the day of October 7th, when babies were being burned alive, when mothers were being raped in front of their families, and we know these things really happened because the Hamas terrorists came in and they had GoPro cameras on their head. They videotaped it. I've watched the video. They were proud of what they were doing. They called back to their families and said, "Today I killed 10 Jews. I'm so proud." Tragically, on the other end of the phone, their parents would say, "Oh, that's wonderful. What a great thing you've done." You can't have that. That's something people should be ashamed of, not proud of. So can there be peace? Of course. But there's got to be a huge attitudinal shift where people no longer think that it is a wonderful thing to kill Jewish people. And you have to believe that they have a right to their indigenous and ancient and historic homeland.
I think what most people kind of, the mutual voice there is that really nobody should be caught up in this crossfire on either side. But it does seem like it's more prevalent on that side. It seems like millions have died. Some people are calling it a genocide. How would you see success in that?
Well, I don't know that millions, you're talking about millions of Muslims have died?
In Gaza?
No, millions haven't. The numbers are, into the thousands, but the numbers that are reported are numbers that they have reported. So I'm not sure how accurate they are because they are known to not necessarily tell the truth. They pretended that there was a bombing of a hospital. Turned out it was an internal bomb that Hamas had owned. It wasn't an Israeli attack. So I think we got to be very careful not to accept when Hamas gives us numbers because they're not necessarily accurate. But yes, civilians have died. There's no doubt about it. But why did they die? Did they die because Israel wanted to kill civilians? No. They died because Hamas put their civilians in front of military targets and hid them. And Israel repeatedly would broadcast messages, send text messages to every phone in Gaza and say, "Get out of this area. We're going to hit it because there's a military installation there. Get out of it." Hamas held their own people hostage in front of those targets, knowing that it was going to result in the deaths of their own people. How cruel can that be? So I wish Hamas wanted to end this, but they've shown no desire. Why haven't they allowed the hostages to go? 4 of them are Americans. I don't understand why America has not put far more pressure on the Iranians, the government, on Qatar, and on Hamas, and saying, even if you don't let the others go, which they should, we demand that you let the Americans go. There are 4 Americans that have been held hostage since October the 7th, and they're still there. And, to pretend that Hamas wants to end this, they don't seem to really want to. They don't want to give up their power. They don't want to give up their wealth. Look, their leaders have lived in luxury while their people have lived in squalor. That's a real reason that this continues to go on.
I think what you just said is a question for many people. Why isn't the United States a little bit more involved in pushing a direction to end this? Why do you think that is? Is there some sort of, with Iran, is there some sort of hesitancy to cause issues with Iran? Are they trying to stay neutral with Iran?
It's something I've never understood. Both the Obama administration and the Biden administration has been very, very accommodating to the Iranian government when we shouldn't have been. The Trump administration was the exception, and their maximum pressure sanctions, which basically said if you do business with the Iranian government, you can't do business with the United States. Well, nobody wants to do business only with the Iranians and not business with the U.S. because we're the biggest marketplace. You can't afford to say no to the Americans and yes to the mullahs. So what happened? People quit doing business with the Iranians, and that was destroying them from inside economically. Why the Biden administration reversed those policies and went back and took their foot off the brake and put it on the gas is something I cannot for the life of me understand. But we've got to go back to the policies that President Trump put in place. People can say what they want to about him, but those policies were effective. And they did not have the financial or really the military capacity to develop a nuclear weapon when Donald Trump was president. We basically relaxed those kind of pressures. And for the life of me, I don't know why.
Okay. Let's pivot to, you have gone to Israel multiple times in your life.
Yeah.
During the next 4 years, it's going to be a little bit of a different trip for you.
Yeah, I won't be coming home after a couple of weeks. There's a certain level of excitement about being able to be there in a capacity. And so, I pray that the confirmation will happen, that I'll be able to take the post and serve my country and my president in this capacity. And excited about the prospects for what maybe we can do to advance the Abraham Accords, which have been historic. But there's also some, anxiety about just pulling up stakes and living halfway around the world from my family, my grandchildren, my church family. Those are things that certainly are going to be adjustments that, Janet and I will have to learn to make. But if you see it as a calling, you see it as an opportunity, then you see it as that mission. This is the next chapter of our lives, and we accept it, and we'll do it with joy.
So obviously you do have your administrative duty, your job responsibilities. What's your dream here?
The dream of what it will mean? Mm-hmm. Having been a part of going over and over again, I think to be able to become even more absorbed in the land of the Bible is so very appealing to me. To walk the places where the prophets and the patriarchs and where Jesus walked. I mean, what could be a more appealing thing for someone whose life has been built around the belief that the Bible is truth and it is the blueprint for life and the roadmap for life, and to be able to live in the land where it was written and where it was delivered, upon which it was founded. What an incredible opportunity that affords. So that I look forward to.
And what do you have to say to Arkansans that, well, not necessarily the younger generation. I don't think they were here when you were governor, but the people that were, the people that have seen you where you started, where you're going now. You said you kind of started in Pine Bluff with your radio stations, and now this is happening. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I'm so grateful for the people of Arkansas that have given me an extraordinary privilege of serving as a governor, and then even in the life after my term as governor, to still be a part of the fabric of the state, to watch it grow. And now, what an incredible thing to watch my daughter take the reins of the office and do phenomenal things, to create an education platform that raises teacher pay to one of the highest in the country, to reform education, to give parents real power to do what's best for their children. Those are things that I stand back and I just am in awe of and so grateful. And on a personal level, to be in the historic position of having the only time in America where a father and a daughter govern the same state. You know, just forget all the governmental part of it. That's just kind of cool. Watch my grandchildren grow up in the house where their mother grew up. That's pretty special. And it's just, you know, to see that from a kid that grew up in a rent house on 2nd Street in Hope, Arkansas, it's been a long but wonderful and blessed journey. I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.
Okay. Do you have anything else you want to add? Anything you think that I missed that would be important? You know, before we don't see you for 4 years.
When David Friedman was the ambassador, and he was a wonderful ambassador, he's a very dear friend. And when I would go there, I found out that he also had played guitar and kept one in Israel. So when I would bring the groups, Ambassador Friedman would come over and we would play music. And I'd bring a group of musicians over from the U.S. In fact, I keep instruments in Israel. I have a whole array of guitars, drums, keyboards, and everything there that we would use for the tour groups. I guess we'll pull it out of the warehouse when I get there. So I guess when I get settled, provided I get confirmed and it all actually happens, I may have to figure out how to build an Israeli rock and roll band with an American bass player. We'll see how that works out.
I think that sounds like a good plan.
Maybe the secret to a peace process.
It'll keep you busy.
Yes, it will.